Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're peeling back the layers on a life that offers one of the most uh, sobering, high-stakes cautionary tales in all of Scripture.
Yeah,
Our deep dive is focused on the life of Abiathar the priest.
that's right. Our mission today is a very focused, thoughtful examination of this single biblical figure, and it's a study designed really for you, the thoughtful believer, especially as you wrestle with, the demands of long-term faithfulness and the immense weight of critical decisions in your own life.
He's such a compelling figure because, unlike some of the more, let's say, famous biblical failures who sort of started badly and ended terribly, Abiathar's story is almost the reverse. I mean, by all historical measures, he was a deeply loyal servant for decades, a trusted companion to King David.
Absolutely. He held the sacred keys to divine access, carrying the ephod, and he served faithfully through political chaos that, frankly, would have broken lesser men.
Right. And so when we look at Abiathar, the question we have to confront is maybe one of the most painful in the entire biblical record.
I think it is.
How can a life so profoundly marked by years of devoted, faithful service, a life that endured exile, trauma, political upheaval for God's anointed king, be so completely undone and redefined by a single critical misjudgment made right at the finish line?
That's the core question, isn't it? It's not about some spectacular sin committed in his youth. This was a failure of wisdom when his experience, by all accounts, should have been at its absolute peak.
Exactly. He was there for these huge sacred moments. And yet, in the final act of the Davidic dynasty, he fails to seek divine counsel. He disastrously aligns himself with Adonijah instead of Solomon.
And the consequences weren't just personal, they were generational, they were prophetic.
So to really get the weight of that failure, I think we need a roadmap.
A comprehensive one, yeah. We'll trace his life backward, starting with that complex lineage and the early trauma he experienced at Nob, which really shaped his entire outlook.
And then we'll examine his faithful period of service to David, focusing specifically on the spiritual power symbolized by that ephod.
Then we pivot. We have to analyze the environment and the political pressures that led to his catastrophic choice to back Adonijah. And we absolutely have to contrast that decision with the quiet, steadfast reverence of Zadok.
And finally, we move beyond just the history to extract the major theological and practical lessons, all anchored firmly in the events described in 1 Kings 2.
Right. This is a story about the cost of presumption. It's a reminder that past faithfulness, no matter how genuine it was, is just not a guarantee of present wisdom.
So, to understand the Abiathar who fell, we have to start with the Abiathar who inherited the role in the first place. You mentioned he came from this tragic, complicated lineage, one that was already shadowed by judgment.
That's exactly where the analysis has to start. Abiathar was a descendant of Eli, and Eli's house had been under a devastating divine judgment for multiple generations.
And this wasn't just a punishment for a simple mistake, right? The judgment in 1 Samuel is explicit. It was because Eli had dishonored the Lord.
Yes, specifically, he had tolerated the blatant corruption and the abuse of the sacred office by his own sons, Hophni and Phinehas.
The text is pretty graphic about it. They were sleeping with women at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they were violently taking the best parts of the sacrificial meat, the parts reserved for God.
Exactly. And Eli's failure was that he honored his sons more than he honored God. He failed to restrain them, and in doing so, he treated the sacrifices of the Lord with contempt. The consequence was terrifying.
The prophet comes and declares this divine purge.
A divine purge. He says no man in Eli's line would live to old age, and the priesthood itself would be transferred to a more faithful priest. So that sets the stage. Abiathar inherits the highest religious position in Israel, a blessed role, but it's simultaneously under this centuries-old prophetic curse.
It just dramatically changes the context of his life, doesn't it?
It changes everything.
It means that the ultimate fulfillment of that judgment, the end of Eli's priesthood, was sort of constantly looming in the background. It provides this really weighty backdrop against which Abiathar's personal choices would eventually seal his family's destiny.
And if that generational shadow wasn't enough, his own immediate experience, his own life, began with a profound and defining trauma, the massacre at Nob.
This incident is just deeply disturbing to read. When David was fleeing from Saul, desperate and alone, he comes to Nob, where Abiathar's father, Ahimelech, was the high priest.
Right, and we should pause on what Ahimelech did there, because his actions show true spiritual insight.
Yeah.
He's approached by this fleeing, famished man, David, who claims to be on an urgent, secret mission for Saul. And in an act of profound compassion, Ahimelech gives David the consecrated bread of the presence.
Which was technically only for the priests.
Only for the priests. But Ahimelech recognized that necessity and mercy outweighed the strict ritual observance, especially when he was serving God's anointed future king.
Yeah.
He also gave him the sword of Goliath.
That act of compassion was immediately betrayed.
Immediately. Doeg the Edomite, who was Saul's chief herdsman, was there. He witnessed the whole thing and reported it back to Saul.
And Saul, just consumed by his paranoia, interprets Ahimelech's kindness as outright treason.
The retaliation that followed was swift, violent, and just devastating. Saul ordered the complete slaughter of the priests of Nob, and when his own servants refused to do it, Doeg the Edomite executed the order himself, slaughtering 85 priests. The scale of the tragedy is immense. It wiped out the entire priestly community, men, women, children, everyone.
And right there is the genesis of Abiathar's life story. He was the sole survivor.
Can you even imagine that?
No. Witnessing the wholesale execution of your entire family, your whole community, at the hands of the king simply because your father showed mercy to David.
So Abiathar escapes and flees directly to David. And this survival, this shared tragedy, it instantly cements this deep, profound, and, profoundly personal loyalty to David.
It creates a foundational bond, for sure. David feels responsible for the death of Abiathar's family. And Abiathar, having witnessed it all, chooses to link his destiny entirely to this fleeing king. It forges a powerful, experience-based loyalty.
And he didn't come empty-handed. This is key.
Right.
Abiathar brought the spiritual infrastructure of Israel's relationship with God with him when he fled to David. He brought the ephod.
And you just can't overstate the importance of the ephod in that era. For anyone unfamiliar, the ephod wasn't merely a ceremonial linen vestment the high priest wore.
No, not at all. It was the crucial spiritual tool that contained, or was at least connected to, the means of divine consultation, the Urim and Thummim.
So by bringing the ephod, Abiathar wasn't just bringing a valuable piece of religious clothing, he was bringing direct access to divine guidance.
Yes. He instantly becomes the essential intermediary for David during those chaotic years in the wilderness.
We see David relying on this connection again and again.
Repeatedly. When his camp was raided by the Amalekites at Ziklag, David was devastated. His men were talking about stoning him. But the first thing he does is command Abiathar to bring the ephod here.
And he inquired of the Lord.
He inquired of the Lord, and he received specific, actionable instructions that led to a complete victory and the recovery of everything they had lost.
That just illustrates the point perfectly. Abiathar was not some peripheral figure. He was the central spiritual conduit for Israel's future king for years. He was faithful in this specific role.
He was. He provided the required wisdom at moment after critical moment. He helped define David's strategy and ensure their survival, which makes his later failure to use that very tool for his own critical decision just so tragic.
He was the keeper of the means of divine guidance, but he ultimately acted without it.
And as we trace Abiathar's path, it's impossible to ignore the man who walked alongside him, the quiet, steady counterpoint, Zadok.
Their partnership seems pretty unique. They served together as high priests under David for decades. But their backgrounds, as you mentioned earlier, were fundamentally different.
Completely different. Zadok came from the line of Eleazar, who was Aaron's eldest surviving son. It was a lineage that reflected covenantal continuity and stability. Abiathar, on the other hand, came from Heli's line, which was shadowed by judgment.
This distinction is crucial, isn't it? It suggests that while both men were incredibly capable and devoted to David, the nature of their faith had different grounding.
That's a great way to put it. Abiathar's loyalty was rooted in a trauma bond, an emotional, experience-based loyalty that was established at Nob. Zadok's, on the other hand, it seems to be grounded in this reverent obedience to God's established covenantal structure, a stability that went beyond personal history or political favors.
And that difference between experience-based loyalty and wisdom grounded in reverent obedience, that's going to be the fault line that separates them when the political winds shift at the end of David's reign.
That's it exactly. The history provides the weight, but the crisis reveals the true foundation.
So when we move into the actual narrative of Abiathar's service, we see that for decades, he really was a model of consistency. I mean, he was utterly reliable through David's darkest times.
He was a standard bearer of faithfulness. He remained staunchly loyal throughout Saul's pursuit. He shared in the hardship and the exile for years. And importantly, he stood firm during Absalom's revolt, which was the ultimate stress test for David's kingdom.
He was a constant figure ministering to David.
He was. And his obedience during Absalom's rebellion is a beautiful, necessary detail to remember.
Yes, when David fled Jerusalem, Abiathar and Zadok initially brought the Ark of God with them. They were prepared to follow David, ready to maintain the spiritual center of Israel wherever the king went.
But David demonstrated incredible spiritual maturity right there. He instructs them to return the ark to the city.
And his reasoning was so profound. He understood that God's presence, represented by the Ark, was a holy trust. It wasn't a political tool or, a military talisman to ensure their safety.
He submitted to God's sovereignty. He said, "If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and let me see both it and his dwelling place."
And Abiathar obeyed. This is highly significant. He was willing to be separated from the most sacred object to return to the heart of the chaos in Jerusalem. It demonstrates true humility.
It does. It shows submission to the kings and implicitly God's purpose. And this was at a moment when he easily could have argued that the ark was essential for their spiritual and military security.
He could have been divisive or self-serving, but he wasn't. He showed wisdom then.
And this previous record of faithfulness is precisely why his later turning point is so jarring. But before we get there, there's another layer of significance we really have to explore.
Go ahead.
Abiathar's service has this fascinating link to the New Testament, reminding us that even his dedicated early actions pointed directly toward Christ.
This is where it gets really interesting. Years and years later, Jesus himself referenced the incident at Nob, the very act of mercy that Abiathar witnessed and survived, when he was defending his disciples for plucking grain on the Sabbath.
That's right. In Matthew 12, Christ appealed to David's reception of the bread of the presence as evidence that mercy and necessity outweigh a strict adherence to the letter of the ritual, provided the actions align with God's core redemptive intent.
He was making an argument about the lordship of the Sabbath and the priority of necessity.
Precisely. And the Jewish listeners would have instantly recognized that story. It's a powerful theological connection.
So Abiathar's personal history, his father's compassionate action, is forever linked to this moment where Christ illustrates these profound messianic truths.
Right. It shows that Abiathar was intimately integrated into God's unfolding redemptive history. He had a front row seat too, and an essential role in some of the most formative moments of Israel's kingdom.
He was a spiritual giant in terms of experience. He carried the ephod, he inquired of the Lord successfully, he withstood the rebellion. His history was ratified by Christ himself.
And yet all of that proximity and all of that historical significance did not translate into present wisdom when the true crisis arrived.
That crisis came near the end of David's life. The stakes were impossibly high. The transition of the crown. It was the critical transitional moment for the newly formed kingdom.
And into this void of uncertainty stepped Adonijah. Adonijah was David's oldest surviving son and, perhaps the heir apparent by natural succession. He exalts himself, prepares chariots and men, and declares his own kingship.
He's trying to seize political momentum before David officially names his successor, Solomon.
Right. And this is the moment that demanded divine consultation. And this is where Abiathar's long obedience tragically unravels. He chose to support Adonijah. He aligned himself with the physical trappings of power and the political establishment.
Let's unpack the political calculus he likely used there. Abiathar had secured the allegiance of Joab, the commander of the army, and Abiathar himself, the chief priest.
And that combination, military power and spiritual validation, made Adonijah's claim look overwhelmingly strong. And maybe, to Abiathar, politically safer.
So he was choosing influence and familiarity. He knew Adonijah, he had served the established order.
But he knew the divine instruction too, didn't he? Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba confirmed that God had chosen Solomon.
So Abiathar must have either actively ignored that knowledge or, and this is maybe more likely, presumed that his decades of service granted him the spiritual authority to decide this transition himself.
He substituted his political calculation for divine instruction. He failed to use the very tool he had carried for 40 years.
And you contrast this with the steady reverence of Zadok, who was Abiathar's co-priest.
Zadok saw all the maneuverings of Adonijah, but he remained loyal to the dying King David. And crucially, he supported Solomon, the son God had clearly chosen and promised.
He honored the divine order. He prioritized the known will of God over the convenience of a political alliance.
Right. And the resolution of the narrative is swift and severe. Solomon, alerted by Nathan and Bathsheba, is crowned and quickly asserts his authority. Adonijah's coup fails.
And in 1 Kings 2, Solomon confronts Abiathar.
The treatment of Abiathar is this powerful combination of mercy and judgment. Solomon says, in effect, "You deserve death for treason, but I will spare your life because you shared in the affliction of my father David and because you carried the ark of the Lord God before my father."
So he spares his life out of respect for his former faithfulness, his shared hardship, his spiritual service.
But the judgment is undeniable. Solomon removes him entirely from the priesthood and exiles him to his property in Anathoth.
And here's the theological crescendo of the entire story.
The text explicitly notes that the removal of Abiathar fulfilled the word of the Lord spoken against the house of Eli generations earlier. This wasn't just a historical event or a political purge. This was the divine settling of accounts.
What began with Eli's son's corruption finally culminates with Abiathar's political miscalculation generations later.
Yes. His personal failure became the prophetic endpoint for a long-standing divine judgment. It is a terrifying example of how one single choice, at one critical moment, can close the door on an entire generational legacy within God's appointed office.
So as we shift from that narrative tragedy to its theological significance, Abiathar's life becomes this profound warning about the very nature of wisdom and the seductive danger of spiritual privilege.
That's exactly right. Abiathar's story fundamentally proves that wisdom is not a static possession that you just accrue over time. It's not something you accumulate through decades of service and then, rely upon like a spiritual pension plan when things get difficult.
That's a challenging point, though, especially for those of us who have walked with the Lord for a long time. I mean, surely those years of spiritual experience and resilience and proven loyalty should count for something more than a single failure.
They do count for mercy, as Solomon showed, but they do not in any way exempt one from the need for present daily discernment. We see a man with an unparalleled resume. He inquired of the Lord countless times, yet he failed to do the single most necessary thing in the most important transitional moment of his career.
He substituted his own accumulated experience for the need to hear God's voice now.
And his long obedience actually magnifies the tragedy because it demonstrates a vulnerability that's common to seasoned believers.
Which is
The vulnerability to spiritual inertia or presumption. The presumption that because I have been faithful in the past, my instincts are now inherently aligned with God's will, even if I bypass the mechanism of seeking instruction.
The source material is so clear on this.
Mm-hmm.
One unwise decision made without consulting the Lord can completely redirect a life's course and tragically affect generations to follow.
It's a reminder that we are only as wise as our last choice.
Theologically, Abiathar really embodies this tension between privilege and responsibility. He had the ultimate privilege. He was the gatekeeper. He carried the sacred objects, stood near the kings, facilitated these holy moments that, as we discussed, were later integrated into messianic teaching.
But proximity to God's work is not the same as submission to God's will. This is the crucial distinction we have to grasp. You can be the one carrying the ephod, the one facilitating access to God's voice for others, and yet fail to heed God's direction yourself when your own life is on the line.
He failed the alignment test. When David's succession required alignment with God's preordained plan for Solomon, Abiathar chose political calculation
The comfort of familiarity, the path of established influence.
over divine revelation. And it wasn't just a political mistake, it was a theological error. By aligning with Adonijah, he was actively opposing God's established redemptive order. He used his spiritual authority, his immense privilege, to back the wrong side.
And here's where we have to fully appreciate Zadok as the theological counterpoint. Zadok's destiny highlights the enduring reward of sustained, reverent wisdom.
Zadok didn't chase the visible advantage. He didn't act impulsively based on who seemed most popular or powerful in the moment.
He remained steady. He honored God's chosen order and his existing loyalty to David and the covenant promise concerning Solomon, and the result was generational reward.
Zadok's faithfulness became a legacy. The priesthood was consolidated in his line, ensuring stability. And this stability wasn't just historical, it was prophetic.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the prophet Ezekiel, writing hundreds of years later, records that in the future, restored kingdom, the sons of Zadok will serve as the exclusive priesthood because they remain faithful when others compromised.
That is a massive theological stamp of approval.
It is. Zadok's consistency in a moment of crisis earned an eternal future honor for his descendants. It shows that wisdom exercised consistently becomes a lasting legacy that endures through generations, far beyond the lifespan of the individual.
It's not just about winning the moment, it's about shaping the future.
And finally, Abiathar's exile underscores God's absolute faithfulness to his word, particularly his word of judgment. The judgment pronounced against Eli's house was generations in the making.
Yet it was fulfilled perfectly through the flawed choice of its last prominent representative.
God's justice unfolded patiently. He allowed Abiathar every opportunity for obedience for decades. He even gave him the role of high priest, demonstrating this long-suffering mercy. But ultimately, Abiathar's removal vindicates God's holiness and truth.
It confirms that God honors both mercy sparing Abiathar's life out of regard for David and righteousness, upholding the prophetic word even when it involves displacing a man of great experience and service.
Right.
So this life, lived 3 millennia ago, carries profound weight for us right now. For the learner trying to navigate modern life with wisdom and faithfulness, what is the primary spiritual warning we take away from all this?
The primary spiritual lesson is a powerful warning. We have to actively guard against the assumption that our past spiritual achievements, our past faithfulness, our past revelations somehow guarantee future alignment with God's will.
That long history of spiritual experience, reputation, or longevity, it can't be a substitute for daily, active dependence on the Lord?
Especially in the moments that matter most.
That's a deeply unsettling thought because we naturally want to believe that our accumulated spiritual capital protects us. But Abiathar reminds us that vulnerability to presumption, it never disappears. So this raises an important question. In our modern lives, what stands out to you as the specific moments or the specific reasons we stop seeking divine counsel?
I believe we stop seeking counsel when we feel we have sufficient experience or knowledge to predict the outcome ourselves. Abiathar was a political veteran. He had endured the Absalom crisis. He likely felt he understood the political dynamics better than the young prophet Nathan or the dying David.
We substitute our own professional calculation for divine instruction.
That's it. Or, I see it in our own lives. We stop seeking counsel when we feel the pressure of the moment requires an immediate practical answer, and waiting for God feels inefficient.
Or maybe when we suspect the advice God would give is inconvenient or runs contrary to the path of least resistance.
It's the failure of presumption. The failure isn't in making a mistake. The failure is the presumption that our knowledge and familiarity can replace humble dependency and earnest prayer. We assume our internal compass is still perfectly calibrated when the environment around us is changing.
And this brings us to the test of transitional moments. David's succession was a monumental transitional moment. The sources emphasize that decisions made when influence is waning, or when leadership shifts, or when pressure mounts, those are often the greatest tests of character and wisdom.
They're the pressure cookers that reveal the true governance of the heart. Abiathar was tested in a political transition, but we're tested in relational transitions, career changes, financial choices. The question remains the same, doesn't it? Are we governed by wisdom, a diligent, humble commitment to God's known will? Or are we governed by self-preservation, a political or comfortable calculation based on familiarity?
So when you, the listener, face a major decision, are you prioritizing the familiar path, the influential colleague, the known quantity? Or are you diligently stopping to seek God's specific instruction for this present unique moment, even if it feels inconvenient?
Abiathar chose comfort and familiarity over the courage required to back God's choice.
And we really shouldn't limit the application to just ourselves. The contrast between the two priests challenges us to look beyond just the immediate personal consequences of our actions and to think about generational impact.
That's so important. Abiathar's choice closed the door on his entire lineage within the priesthood, a position that had been theirs for generations.
But Zadok's singular, faithful decision opened the door for his sons to receive extraordinary promises for the future kingdom, a legacy that still held relevance hundreds of years later in Ezekiel's prophecy.
Choices rooted in divine wisdom bless succeeding generations. They create a spiritual foundation for them. Conversely, unwise alignments, even if your life is spared, can dramatically limit your future usefulness and the spiritual legacy of those who follow you.
It reinforces that idea that faithfulness in obscurity often prepares the ground for lasting generational honor,
while compromise at a critical juncture can undermine even the most impressive previous record of service.
And finally, if we connect this all to the bigger picture of God's redemptive work, we find a deep comfort amidst the warning.
We do. Abiathar's failure did not derail God's redemptive plan, it fulfilled it. And that is a critical insight for the believer who's facing doubt or fear.
Yes, God's sovereignty always prevails. Solomon ascended, the Davidic covenant advanced, and the priesthood was purified precisely as God had intended through the judgment on Eli's house.
And the crucial insight here is this: God's purposes always prevail, regardless of human failure. We can't thwart his ultimate plan. However, our individual participation in those purposes is entirely dependent upon our wisdom and our obedience.
We have a choice.
We have a choice. We can choose to be participants in his plan through obedience, like Zadok, leading to blessing and an enduring legacy. Or we can become catalysts for prophetic fulfillment through failure, like Abiathar. God will use the choices of both, but only one path leads to honor and generational blessing.
Abiathar's life stands as one of the most solemn reminders in Scripture. Here was a man of long service, sincere loyalty, and sacred responsibilities who was nonetheless undone by acting without divine counsel when it mattered most.
His sincere loyalty was insufficient to overcome his profound failure of wisdom.
And Zadok's contrasting path gives us the affirmation we need. His story affirms that steadfast obedience and reverent wisdom lead not only to personal faithfulness, but to enduring honor and long-term usefulness in God's kingdom.
Which brings us back to that encouragement, the passage that should fuel our daily dependence.
Yes, 1 Samuel 12:24. It speaks directly to the source of wisdom and faithfulness we need.
That verse says, "Therefore fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you."
It's a beautifully layered and practical command, isn't it? It moves us from fearing the Lord, recognizing his ultimate authority and holiness, to active, heartfelt service in the present.
And that service, critically, is fueled by contemplation. We must constantly be mindful of his prior acts of greatness, his faithfulness to us in the past. And this contemplation shouldn't just make us grateful, it should fuel our wisdom in the present.
How so?
By providing the courage and conviction to trust his known will over our personal calculation. Remembering God's past actions informs how we trust and obey him today.
So, considering the great things God has done for you, the past traumas he has healed, the guidance he has given, where in your life right now are you most tempted to trust familiarity, influence, or your own lengthy experience, rather than actively stopping and consulting divine wisdom?
May the Lord grant you the spirit of wisdom and the fear of the Lord to guide your steps, that you may serve him faithfully with all your heart in every decision, large or small.